In 1849, a British archaeologist shouldered his way through collapsed stone corridors beneath the mounds of northern Iraq and broke into a sealed chamber that no human being had entered in more than 2,000 years. What he found inside were thousands of clay tablets, stacked and scattered and half-fused by ancient fire, each one pressed with tiny wedge-shaped marks in a language that would take another generation of scholars to decode. When they finally did decode it, the story those marks told was one that no one had expected to find, and one that no one in the century and a half since has been able to fully explain. In 1947, on the other side of the ancient world, a young shepherd threw a stone into a crack in a limestone cliff above the western shore of the Dead Sea, heard the sound of pottery shattering in the dark, and reached inside. What he pulled out were scrolls sealed in clay jars, scrolls so old they crumbled when touched, scrolls in languages that scholars would spend decades studying. Scrolls that, when they were finally read in full, described a set of events so close to what had been found in those Iraqi chambers that the parallel stopped seasoned researchers cold. 2 discoveries, 2 sites separated by more than 1,000 miles of desert and mountain. 2 languages with no common ancestor. 2 civilizations that, by every reasonable account, had no direct contact in the period when these texts were composed, and yet the story was the same. Not approximately the same, not thematically similar in the loose way that all ancient cultures tell flood stories and creation myths. The same sequence of events, the same kind of beings, described in the same physical terms. The same list of forbidden knowledge passed to early humans, the same punishment, the same flood, the same solitary survivor. And, most unsettlingly, the same specific numbers that appear in both traditions with a precision that casual borrowing cannot entirely explain. Tonight, you don't need to resolve the question. You don't need to choose a side. The question has been sitting inside these stones and scrolls for 4,000 years, and it is patient enough to wait a while longer. All you need to do right now is listen. Let your breathing slow. Let the room settle around you. This is one of the oldest stories in the world, and it has been waiting a long time for a quiet audience. Let's begin at the beginning, which, in this case, is a mound of dirt in northern Iraq in the autumn of 1849. The man who broke into the chamber was named Austin Henry Layard. He was not, by modern standards, a careful scientist. He was 32 years old, self-educated in the way that 19th century gentlemen sometimes were, possessed of enormous physical energy, and a romantic conviction that the past had left behind things worth finding. He had been digging in the low, artificial mound the local people called Kuyunjik for several years, pulling out fragments of carved stone, broken ivory, shards of inscribed clay, all of which he shipped back to London with the enthusiasm of a man who suspected he was on the edge of something large. He was. What Layard had tunneled into was the palace of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who had ruled from the city of Nineveh in the 7th century before the Common Era. Ashurbanipal was one of the only literate kings of his entire era. Most rulers of the ancient Near East could not read, not because they were unintelligent, but because writing was a specialist craft, the work of scribes, not kings. Ashurbanipal had been educated differently. He could read in multiple languages, including Sumerian, which by his own time had been a dead tongue for more than 1,000 years. And he was obsessed, with the kind of obsession that only people of genuine intellectual passion develop, with the old texts, the ones composed before his own civilization existed, the ones in languages that his own court scribes could barely decipher. He had dispatched agents across the entire breadth of his empire with a single instruction: find the old tablets, copy them, bring them back. Over the decades of his reign, what returned to Nineveh was the largest library the ancient world had ever assembled. Tens of thousands of tablets, organized and cataloged and stored in rooms of the palace, with a care that anticipated modern archival practice by 25 centuries. When the Medes and Babylonians sacked Nineveh in 612 BCE, the palace burned. The fires destroyed everything that could be destroyed. But clay, when it is fired, becomes ceramic. Ceramic does not rot. Ceramic does not burn a second time. The very catastrophe that erased the Assyrian Empire preserved its library. The tablets that Laird and his successors pulled from the rubble over the following decades were not damaged. They were baked. They had survived. The work of reading them fell to a small group of scholars working in London and Paris and Berlin. The languages on the tablets, Sumerian and its successor Akkadian, had been dead for more than 2 millennia. There were no living speakers, no dictionaries, no grammar books. The scholars who took on this task had to reconstruct the languages the way a musician reconstructs a score from notation she has never heard performed, from context, from comparison, from sheer cognitive force applied over decades. What they found when they broke through was not what they had expected. They had expected administrative records, tax documents, inventories of grain. Those existed, certainly, but mixed in with the receipts and the inventories were other things, older things, things that made the scholars set down their tools and stare. There were creation stories that predated the Book of Genesis by more than 1,000 years, written in language so similar to Genesis, in places that the parallels could not be dismissed. There were flood narratives in which a single man was warned by a god, built a great boat, survived a deluge that drowned the world, and released birds to test whether the waters had receded. There were king lists recording rulers who had reigned before the flood for spans of time so vast, 28,000 years, 36,000 years, that no rational reader could take them at face value. Something was being preserved in those numbers that ordinary chronology could not contain. And there were the tablets that described the Anunnaki. The word itself is a small puzzle. It is built from Sumerian components that scholars have argued over for more than a century. The first part, Anu or An, is the Sumerian name for the sky and for the sky god, the highest deity in the early Sumerian pantheon. The second part is harder, and the debate over it matters more than most popular treatments allow. The academic consensus translates the whole word as something like the offspring of Anu, or the princely seed of the sky god, that is, the divine descendants of the highest heavenly authority. A looser and more popular reading, associated with the writer Zechariah Sitchin, renders the name as those who from heaven came to earth. Most Assyriologists consider this translation a stretch, but the popular version has spread so widely that it has shaped the way millions of people think about these beings before they have read a single original line about them. What the texts actually say is strange enough without any embellishment. The Anunnaki, in their earliest appearances in the written record, are beings whose origin is associated with the sky and whose presence is experienced on the earth. They are not abstract forces or vague spiritual presences. They have names. They have personalities. They argue with one another. They make decisions that have consequences. They build things. They organize labor. They establish cities and hierarchies and systems of governance. They read, in the bluntest, honest description, like records of an organization. A very old, very powerful, very strange organization, but an organization nonetheless. The younger civilization that would eventually describe the Watchers. In 1947, in a cave above the western shore of the Dead Sea, a shepherd's stone broke a jar that had been sealed for more than 2,000 years. Inside were scrolls. When the scholars who eventually cataloged those scrolls worked through the fragments, they found, among the copies of Isaiah and Psalms and Deuteronomy, something unexpected. Portions of a text that the Western Christian world had not been able to read since approximately the 5th century of the Common Era. The Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is, depending on how you count, either the most important religious text most people have never heard of, or one of the most significant works of ancient religious imagination that was deliberately excluded from the mainstream tradition. It exists in 3 main versions. Scholars call them 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch. When people say the Book of Enoch, they almost always mean 1st Enoch, and when they mean 1st Enoch, the portion that matters most for tonight is the oldest section of that composite work, the Book of the Watchers, which may date to as early as the 3rd century before the Common Era. The Book of Enoch is written in the voice of Enoch, the patriarch mentioned in the 5th chapter of Genesis, in one of the strangest and most compressed sentences in all of Scripture. Enoch, the text says, walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He does not die, he simply ceases to be present. The text leaves a gap where his ending should be. And the Book of Enoch is, in its oldest and most essential form, the story of what happened in that gap, what Enoch saw, what he was shown, what he was told to write down before he was taken. For several centuries, the Book of Enoch was read widely in Jewish and early Christian communities. It is quoted in the New Testament by name in the letter of Jude, which preserves a passage from 1st Enoch as if it were authoritative scripture. Early Christian writers, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus, treated it with respect. Then, slowly, it began to disappear. The process was not a single dramatic decision. It was more like erosion. Different centers of the early church came to different conclusions about which texts belonged in the canon. The Book of Enoch, perhaps because its claims about angels and divine politics sat uncomfortably beside the developing theology of the institutional church, drifted toward the margins. By the 5th century, it was effectively gone from the Western Christian world. There was one place, however, where it had never been let go. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian communities on earth, founded in the 4th century, rooted in a religious culture that predates the doctrinal disputes of medieval Europe, had preserved the entire Book of Enoch in its scriptural canon, in the ancient Ethiopian language of Ge'ez. They had been reading it, copying it, treating it as sacred the entire time. No one in Europe had thought to ask. In 1773, a Scottish traveler named James Bruce carried 3 complete manuscripts of the Ethiopian Book of Enoch back to Britain. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, the Western world had access to a text it had almost entirely forgotten. And then, in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed what the Ethiopian manuscripts had preserved. Portions of 1st Enoch in Aramaic, old fragments from at least 11 separate manuscripts, some dated to around 200 BCE, emerged from Cave 4 at Qumran. The book was genuinely ancient. It had been in circulation in Jewish communities centuries before the time of Jesus. It had not been a minor or fringe text. In the community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, copies of 1st Enoch were actually more numerous than copies of many books that did make it into the Bible. So here is what we have: 2 discoveries separated by almost a century of time. The clay tablets of Nineveh in 1849, the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, both describing, in their different languages and their different theological frameworks, the same thing. Beings from the sky, a descent, a list of forbidden knowledge transmitted to early humans, hybrid offspring, judgment from a higher authority, a flood, a survivor. The question that no one has fully answered is why. There is a temptation, when looking at the 2 traditions side by side, to collapse them into one, to say, this is the same story, told twice. But that collapse would be too easy, and it would miss the most interesting thing about the parallel. Because the 2 descents are not the same descent. They cannot be. And the ways in which they differ are precisely as revealing as the ways in which they agree. Let us look at the Sumerian version first, because it is older by at least 1,000 years, and because it gives us the official story, the version told from inside the established order. According to the Atrahasis epic, the Enuma Elish and a cluster of smaller tablets recovered from the libraries of Nippur and Ur, the Anunnaki did not always live on the earth. They came from somewhere else. The texts describe the origin point as the heavens, as the sky, as the domain of Anu. But the heavens, in Sumerian cosmology, are not an abstraction. They are a place. A real place with gates and gardens and rivers. The ancient scribes described it the way a traveler might describe a foreign country she had visited once and never quite stopped thinking about. The first wave of Anunnaki arrived on the earth with a mandate. The Atrahasis epic is specific about what the mandate entailed. It involved digging, hydraulic engineering on a scale that no human civilization at the time could have attempted. The opening lines of the text describe divine beings clearing waterways, hollowing out the beds of rivers, rivers that the tablets identify as the Tigris and the Euphrates, the twin arteries of Mesopotamian civilization, the 2 rivers without which none of what followed would have been possible. The texts describe this work as enormous, grueling, and entirely deliberate. The shaping of the land for habitation, the preparation of the earth for a civilization that had not yet arrived. The being most closely associated with this first descent was Enki, whose name in Sumerian means something like Lord of the Earth, but whose character in the texts is far more complex than any title can capture. Enki is the god of fresh water and of the deep, the underground reservoir called the Abzu, from which rivers were believed to rise. He is the god of crafts and of cunning and of solutions to problems that should not have solutions. He is the engineer among the gods, the one you would go to if you needed something built that had never been built before. He is also, as we will see later, the god who disagreed with the decision to destroy humanity in the flood, and who found a loophole, because that is what he does. The first descent of the Anunnaki, in the Sumerian account, was authorized. It was official. It was conducted with the knowledge and sanction of the highest divine authority. The Anunnaki came down because they were sent. The mission was structured, planned, and executed with the kind of organizational logic that the Sumerian scribes applied to everything they considered important. Now hold that account in one hand and pick up the Book of Enoch in the other. Open it to chapter 6. The first 6 verses of the Book of the Watchers. The text begins with a reference to the strange 4-verse passage in Genesis chapter 6. The passage about the sons of God who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives from among them. That Genesis passage is one of the most compressed and mysterious passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is the broken edge of a much longer story. The Book of Enoch gives us the longer version. According to 1st Enoch, the sons of God who descended in the days of Jared, Jared being the father of Enoch, the great-great-grandfather of Noah, were not vague spiritual presences. They were specific beings, 200 of them. They had a leader whose name was Semyaza, sometimes written Shemyaza. They had subordinate commanders, 20 of them, each with 10 followers beneath them. The organizational structure is military, precise ranks, clear chain of command, 200 individuals, counted and named. They descended, the text says, on the summit of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is a real mountain. It sits on the border between modern Lebanon and Syria, its southern peak rising more than 9,000 feet above the surrounding landscape. Snow lies on its summit for most of the year. On a clear day, from the top, you can see across the Bekaa Valley, across the Galilee, across the upper reaches of the Jordan River. It is the kind of elevation that, in the ancient world, would have carried a sense of sacred weight almost by default. The highest places were always the threshold places, the places where the rules of the ordinary world thinned. The Book of Enoch tells us that the 200 named the mountain. They called it Hermon, and the text engages in an etymological play that may or may not be linguistically sound, but is clearly intentional. The Semitic root the name is derived from, karam, can carry a meaning of being set apart or placed under oath. The text seems to be suggesting that the mountain was named for what was sworn there, and what was sworn there was the oath of the descent itself. Because the 200 knew they were doing something forbidden. They knew it before they stepped off. A higher authority had prohibited exactly what they were about to do. And before they crossed that line, before they descended fully into the human world, they swore to one another that they would share in whatever consequences followed. It was a mutual binding, a hostage arrangement among themselves. None of them could turn back. None of them could defect. They were all in it together, whatever it meant, whatever came after. Then they descended. Now place the two stories side by side and look at both of them honestly. The Sumerian account describes a descent that was authorized, official, sanctioned from above. The Enochic account describes a descent that was unauthorized, covert, and undertaken in explicit defiance of a higher command. These cannot be the same event. The authorization status alone makes them different. The leaders are different, Enki in one account, Semyaza in another. The numbers don't perfectly match. The location is different. And yet, both descents are physical. Both involve a counted, named group of beings, not a vague crowd, but a specific number. Both involve a clear leadership structure. Both are deliberate and planned in advance, executed with full knowledge of the stakes. Both involve a specific geographical landing point that is remembered for centuries afterward as the place where something irreversible happened. And both are followed, almost immediately, by the same sequence of events. Knowledge transmitted to humans, physical union between the descending beings and human women, hybrid offspring, punishment from a higher authority, a catastrophic flood, and a single survivor. The mainstream scholarly explanation for this parallel is literary transmission. The Book of Enoch borrowed from the older Mesopotamian material, which the Jewish scribes who composed it knew intimately after the Babylonian exile. This explanation is serious. It is supported by real textual evidence, and we will return to it with the weight it deserves. But there is another reading that the texts themselves seem to invite if you sit with them long enough. What if the two accounts are not describing the same descent at all? What if they are describing two descents separated by time? The Anunnaki as the first wave, official, authorized, operating within whatever institutional hierarchy they answered to. The 200 Watchers as a later wave, a faction, a breakaway group, a rebellion within the same larger order that came down without permission to do something the first group had been explicitly prohibited from doing. In this reading, the Sumerian tablets preserve the official record, told from the standpoint of the established order. The Book of Enoch preserves the dissenting record, told from the standpoint of an authority that judged the unauthorized descent as transgression. Two sides of the same story, two angles on the same set of events. The differences between the accounts would not be contradictions. They would be the expected differences between the institutional version of a disputed event and the version preserved by those who judged it as a crime. 200 beings on a mountain they named the set-apart place. 50 beings led by Enki into the marshlands of what would become civilization's cradle. In both cases, what followed changed the world permanently. The question is not which account is right. The question is why both accounts exist at all. And the only honest answer tonight is that we don't entirely know. If the descent is the strangest parallel between the two traditions, the second strangest, and in some ways the most practically significant, is what happened after the descent. Because in both the Sumerian tablets and the Book of Enoch, the beings who came down did not simply arrive and observe. They taught. They taught specific things, in specific subjects, with specific and lasting results. And the curriculum they taught, across two traditions that did not share a living language, is almost identical. Let us begin with the Enochic list, because it is unusually precise. First Enoch, chapter 8, is one of the most peculiar chapters in any ancient religious text. It reads, in places, less like scripture and more like a faculty roster at a very strange and slightly menacing university. The text gives us names, the names of specific watchers, and assigns to each name a specific field of instruction. The first name on the list is Azazel. In the Enochic tradition, Azazel is the watcher who taught humanity the working of metals. Not the theoretical knowledge that metals existed, but the practical, physical knowledge of how to extract iron and copper from the earth, how to build a forge, how to control temperature, how to shape molten material into useful forms. And the forms, the text tells us immediately, were weapons, swords, knives, daggers, breastplates, shields. The curriculum of metallurgy and the curriculum of warfare were not separate subjects in Azazel's teaching. They were the same subject, and then, in the same passage, almost as a dark coda to the weapons instruction, Azazel is also said to have taught the women. He taught them the use of cosmetics, the dyeing of eyelids, the wearing of precious stones, the art of adornment, of making the body appear different from what it naturally was. The juxtaposition is so deliberate that no careful reader can miss it. Weapons for men, ornaments for women. Two sides of the same underlying gift, the ability to transform the world and the self into something nature alone would not have produced. The artificial, the made thing, the intervention between the raw and the refined. The second name is Semyaza himself, the leader. The text is less specific about what he taught directly, but the implication is that his particular area was incantation, the use of spoken language to bind things that would not otherwise be bound, the art of the word as a tool of compulsion. Then comes Amaros, who taught the resolving of incantations, the counterart, the skill of undoing what other watchers had tied. And here, even within the curriculum itself, you can already see a kind of internal arms race. One being teaches a binding, another teaches the unbinding. The technology spirals. Barakel taught the reading of lightning, whether literal meteorology or divination by celestial signs. The text is ambiguous. Kokabel taught the reading of the stars, not astronomy in the modern mathematical sense, but the older practice of mapping celestial patterns onto human destinies. Tamiel taught the technical measurement of the heavens, the beginning of what we would recognize as mathematical astronomy. Sariel taught the courses of the moon, the lunar calendar, the prediction of phases. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth, geomancy, the reading of the land itself for meaning. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Stop here. Look at what this list contains as a collection, not as individual exotic subjects, but as a body of knowledge taken together. Metallurgy, weapons technology, astronomy, lunar calendrical science, meteorology, geomancy, celestial divination, the arts of personal adornment and long-distance trade in luxury goods. These are not random specialties. They are not the arbitrary enthusiasms of a few scattered supernatural teachers. Taken together, they constitute almost exactly the foundational technologies of early human civilization. Metallurgy is what allows a Stone Age culture to become a Bronze Age culture, and eventually an Iron Age culture. Astronomy and the lunar calendar are the necessary prerequisites for large-scale agriculture. You cannot plant crops reliably without knowing when the seasons turn. Geomancy and the reading of earth signs are the earliest forms of mineral prospecting and land surveying. Knowledge of the sky is the prerequisite for navigation at any scale beyond the local. The arts of adornment are the beginning of luxury goods trade, which is the beginning of long-distance commerce. The Book of Enoch is, in effect, providing a comprehensive list of the technologies that made human civilization possible. And it is saying, clearly, explicitly, without metaphor, that humans did not develop these technologies on their own. They were given, transmitted, by specific beings with specific names who the text considers it important enough to record. Now here is the thing that has genuinely troubled scholars and readers for more than a century. Every single subject on the Enochic list shows up in the archaeological record at roughly the same moment in human prehistory. Metallurgy emerges, astronomy emerges, calendar systems emerge, weapons technology emerges, long-distance trade in luxury goods emerges. They appear together in the same general region, the Fertile Crescent, the arc of cultivable land running from southern Iraq up through the Levant, and within the same general window of time, between approximately 6,000 and 3,000 BCE. By archaeological standards, that window is narrow. By the standards of the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence that preceded it, during which stone tools changed at a pace measured in geological time, the window is so tight that it looks, from a certain angle, like an event, like someone threw a switch. Modern archaeology has its explanations for this compression: the agricultural revolution, the rise of sedentary populations, the post-glacial climate, the accumulation of population density past some critical threshold that made specialization possible. These are real explanations. They account for a great deal. But they do not, by themselves, fully account for why so many independent technologies arrived in such a tight cluster, in such a geographically specific region, after such an extended period of comparative stasis. The Book of Enoch offers a different account. The technologies arrived together because they were brought together by beings who possessed them already, who taught them to a species that had not yet developed them, in defiance, the text insists, of an authority that had explicitly prohibited the transfer. Now look at the Sumerian version of the same idea, because the Sumerian tradition also gives us a list of teachers and a curriculum, and the parallels are remarkable, even accounting for the cultural contact that undoubtedly existed between the two traditions. In the Sumerian and later Babylonian records, the bringers of civilization's foundational knowledge to early humanity were called the Apkallu. The word is sometimes translated as sages or wise ones, but neither translation conveys the strangeness of what the texts actually describe. The Apkallu were not human teachers. They were not gods in the full Sumerian sense either. They were intermediate beings, half divine, half something else, created by Enki in the deep freshwaters of the Abzu, and sent up into the human world with a specific mandate. A cuneiform text puts it in language that is worth reading slowly. They were sent to ensure the correct execution of the plans of heaven and earth. The correct execution of the plans of heaven and earth. That is a mandate. That is institutional language. That is the phrasing of beings who understood themselves to be agents of a structured authority, carrying out a policy that had been decided above their level. There were 7 Apkallu in the standard tradition, 7 before the flood, each associated with one of the 7 antediluvian kings who had ruled before the Great Deluge. Our most important source for their names is a Neo-Assyrian ritual text called the Bit Misri, the Protected House, an incantation series designed to guard a dwelling against malevolent forces, whose 3rd tablet contains the oldest surviving, complete catalog of the 7. The names are Uana, the first, said to have completed the plans of heaven and earth, Uanaduga, endowed with comprehensive intelligence, and Meduga, to whom a good fate was allotted, and Megalama, born in a house, and Mebuluga, who grew up on pasture land, and Enlilda, the conjurer of the city of Eridu, always Eridu, always the first city, in every version of the story, and Utuabzu, the 7th, of whom the text says something that makes you stop and read the line again. It says that Utuabzu ascended into heaven. The 7th Apkallu, the last of the antediluvian sages, ended his time on the earth by being taken up into the sky. And in the Hebrew tradition, the 7th patriarch from Adam, a man named Enoch, walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. 7th and taken. 7th and taken. This is not a loose parallel. The Norwegian scholar Helge Kvanvig, one of the foremost specialists in the Enochic literature, has argued in meticulous detail that the figure of Enoch is patterned directly on the Mesopotamian figures of Enmeduranki and Utuabzu. That the Hebrew patriarch who ascended was, at some deep level of cultural transmission, a Jewish remembering of a Mesopotamian being who had already been recorded in cuneiform for more than 1,000 years before the composition of Genesis. The argument is not speculative. It is published in peer-reviewed scholarship and is widely taken seriously by specialists. But now, look at the curriculum the Apkallu brought. The most vivid summary comes from a Babylonian priest named Berosus, who lived in the 3rd century BCE and wrote a history of his civilization in Greek, the language of his new masters, after Alexander's conquests had remade the ancient world. Berosus's original work, which he called the Babylonica, is lost. We know it through quotations preserved by later writers, but the passages that survive about the first Apkallu are specific and strange enough that it is worth reading them slowly. According to Berosus, the first Apkallu, the one he calls Oannes, which is the Greek rendering of the Sumerian name Uana, emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf during the reign of the very first king in the very first city. Oannes, Berosus tells us, had a fish-like form covering a human form. Above the waist, he was clearly humanoid. Below the waist, or draped over him like a ritual garment, was the form of a great fish. His face was a human face, but it emerged from beneath the head of the fish, as if a man were wearing an elaborate ceremonial costume. Oannes came out of the water at dawn. He spent the day among the people of the first city, and he taught them. He taught them the art of writing. the construction of cities, the building of temples, the measurement of land, the principles of law, mathematics, agriculture. And at sunset he returned to the water. He did not eat human food. He did not sleep on land. He gave the day to teaching, and the night to wherever it was he had come from. 6 more Apkallu followed, each associated with the reign of a different antediluvian king. And then, Atrahasis tells us, the flood came. After the flood, the direct presence of the Apkallu on the earth came to an end. In a phrase that later Greek writers preserved with particular care, Atrahasis wrote, "From that time, nothing further has been discovered. Nothing further." The implication is that everything that underwrites civilization, every foundational technology and art and law, was given in the window between the descent of Oannes and the coming of the flood, and that after the flood, human knowledge has been at best the careful and partial preservation of that inheritance. Now read the 2 curricula side by side. The Watchers taught metallurgy. The Apkallu taught the working of materials. The Watchers taught astronomy and the lunar calendar. The Apkallu taught the measurement of time. The Watchers taught the reading of celestial and terrestrial signs. The Apkallu taught divination and the interpretation of omens. The Watchers taught the making of weapons. The Apkallu taught the establishment of cities and the laws by which cities are organized. In the ancient world, you could not have cities without weapons, and you could not have weapons without metallurgy, and the chain runs all the way down. The Watchers taught the arts of personal adornment. The Apkallu taught the crafts and the arts. The lists are not identical in their wording. They were composed in different languages, in different theological frameworks, by writers who almost certainly did not know each other's texts directly. But the lists cover the same territory. They name the same foundational body of human knowledge. They locate that knowledge in the same window of deep human prehistory. And they attribute it to the same kind of source, beings from elsewhere, whose presence on the earth was temporary, who transmitted to humanity what humanity would not otherwise have possessed. The Sumerian tradition does not, on the whole, treat the Apkallu as criminals. They are mostly benevolent figures, agents of the highest divine authority, executing a sanctioned policy of human education. The Book of Enoch says the Watchers were absolutely forbidden from doing what they did, that their teaching was a crime, that it brought corruption into the world, and that they were punished for it without appeal. This is a real and important difference, and it should not be minimized. But when 2 traditions agree precisely on the concrete details, who, what, when, where, and disagree only on the moral valence, what they are usually preserving is not 2 independent inventions. They are preserving a memory that has been interpreted from 2 different positions in relation to a disputed event. The authorized side calls it policy. The dissenting side calls it crime. The curriculum was the same. The beings were the same kind of beings, and the world that resulted from the teaching was the same world. There is a document that most popular treatments of this subject either omit entirely or mention only in passing, and its omission is a serious one, because this document does not merely suggest a parallel between the 2 traditions. It does not invite the reader to notice a resemblance and draw a private conclusion. It reaches across the boundary between the 2 traditions in the most explicit possible way. It takes a hero from the Mesopotamian world by name, and it places him inside the Anunnaki story as if he had always belonged there. The document is called the Book of Giants. For most of the 20th century, the Book of Giants was known only by reference. Medieval Jewish writers mentioned it, early Christian heresiologists condemned it, and a 3rd century Persian religious founder named Mani had incorporated a version of it into the scriptural canon of his new faith, Manichaeism, which at its peak extended from the Mediterranean coast to the western edges of China. Fragments of Mani's version had turned up throughout the 20th century in the ruins of monasteries along the old Silk Road, written in Middle Persian and Sogdian and Uyghur and even medieval Chinese. Scholars knew that Mani must have been working from something older. They did not know what. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls opened the question. Among the thousands of fragments catalogued from the 11 caves above the western shore of the Dead Sea, scholars identified Aramaic text that matched the framework of the Book of Giants. The fragments came from multiple caves, identified in the formal catalog as 1Q23, 1Q24, 2Q26, 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q531, 4Q532, 4Q556, and 6Q8. The work of assembling and identifying them took decades. The initial identifications were made by the Polish-French scholar Józef Milik in the 1970s. The definitive modern study was published by the British scholar Lauren Stukenbrook in 1997 in a volume issued by Moore Seebeck in the Distinguished Supplements to the Journal for the Study of Judaism series. The oldest surviving manuscript of the Book of Giants at Qumran, identified as 4Q530, has been dated on paleographic grounds to approximately 100 BCE, but the composition itself is older. Some scholars place its origins in the late 3rd or early 2nd century BCE, making it roughly contemporary with, or even slightly earlier than, the Book of the Watchers. And at Qumran, the Book of Giants was not obscure. The scholar George Nicholsburg, in his standard commentary on 1st Enoch, notes that the Book of Giants was, by the measure of surviving copies, one of the most frequently copied texts in the entire collection. The community that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls considered it important enough to copy at least 9 separate times. They did not let it go. What is the Book of Giants about? It is about what the Watchers left behind. The book takes the basic framework established in the Book of the Watchers, the 200, the Oath on the Mountain, the Forbidden Teaching, the union with human women, and then does something the older text does not do. It zooms in. It puts the narrative at ground level among the hybrid offspring themselves. It gives the giants names. It lets them speak. It shows them arguing, planning, dreaming, and terrified. 2 of the giants named in the Qumran fragments are called Ohia and Hahia, brothers identified as the sons of Semyaza himself, the leader of the descent. A third is named Mahweh. In one of the most remarkable passages in the fragment identified as 4Q530, Mahweh is described as flying across the desert, over what the text calls the Great Desolation, to reach the patriarch Enoch, who is living somewhere far from the events, and to ask him to interpret the dreams the giants have been having. The image of a giant in flight crossing the earth like wind is the kind of image that stays in the mind. The dreams the giants are having are dreams of judgment. In 4Q530, column 2, one of the giants describes a vision in which a great throne is erected in heaven. A figure whose hair is like pure wool takes his seat upon it. The courts of heaven convene. A judgment is delivered. This vision is almost word for word identical to a passage in the biblical Book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 9 and 10. Scholars have written extensively on the relationship between the two throne visions. No serious reader thinks the agreement is a coincidence. But the detail that makes the Book of Giants the bridge it is, the detail that changes what we are allowed to say about the relationship between the two traditions, is a name. A single name embedded in the Aramaic text of the Qumran fragments that stops every careful reader cold when they encounter it. Gilgamesh. Yes, that Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, the hero of the oldest surviving long-form narrative poem in the history of human literature. The figure described in the opening lines of his own epic as 2/3 God and 1/3 man. The man who traveled to the ends of the earth to find the survivor of the flood and learn the secret of eternal life. The king whose name was pressed into the clay at Nineveh among the very tablets that Layard pulled from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library. In the Aramaic fragments of the Book of Giants, Gilgamesh appears as one of the giants, a Nephilim, an offspring of a watcher and a human woman. The name is preserved in the Aramaic script, transliterated as Gilgamesh, and it appears in a context that is unmistakably narrative. In 4Q530, Ohia speaks to Gilgamesh about a terrible dream, a dream of destruction, a vision of the annihilation that is coming for them and all their kind. The two of them share the unease of beings who know, without being able to stop it, that their time is running out. And alongside the name of Gilgamesh appears another name that no reader of the Epic of Gilgamesh will fail to recognize. Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest whom Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill in the most famous sequence of the Akkadian epic. In the Book of Giants, Humbaba is also a giant, also counted among the children of the Watchers, also waiting for judgment. Hold on to what this means. A Jewish text written in Aramaic, probably composed in the 3rd or early 2nd century BCE, preserved in a cave by the Dead Sea for more than 2,000 years, treated as sacred enough by its community to be copied 9 times. This text explicitly and by name identifies the hero of the oldest Mesopotamian epic as one of the offspring of the fallen angels of Genesis chapter 6. This is not a silent structural parallel. This is not two traditions happening to use similar language without being aware of each other. This is a Jewish writer in Aramaic reaching across the linguistic and theological boundary to the Mesopotamian tradition, picking up one of its most famous figures by name and placing him inside the Enochic narrative as if the placement were entirely natural. As if Gilgamesh had always been a Nephilim, as if the Jewish and the Mesopotamian traditions had always been telling portions of the same story about the same beings. The cautious scholarly reading of this is that the author of the Book of Giants was a Jewish writer who had grown up in a world saturated with Mesopotamian literature, as all educated people in the Near East of the Hellenistic period were, after the Babylonian exile, and centuries of cultural interchange, and who incorporated Gilgamesh as a kind of learned literary reference. A nod to a famous figure from a tradition the readers would have known. In this reading, the Book of Giants is evidence of cultural contact, not of shared historical memory. That is the cautious reading. It is a defensible reading, but it does not quite account for everything the text does, because Gilgamesh in the Book of Giants is not a footnote. He is not an illusion. He is a character. He participates in the inner emotional life of the narrative. He and Ohia share their fear. They deliberate together about what the dreams mean. This is not the way you treat a literary reference. This is the way you treat someone you believe actually existed. Someone whose story was real history. Someone whose presence in your text is not decorative, but essential to the account of what happened. One honest reading of the Book of Giants is that its author believed the Mesopotamian material was, at some level, true. Not metaphorically useful. True that Gilgamesh had been a real being. That the story preserved in the Akkadian epic was a partial and culturally filtered memory of a history that the Jewish tradition was also preserving from a different angle, with a different theological frame. And that the Book of Giants was doing what an honest historian does when confronted with two independent sources about the same events, cross-referencing, acknowledging that both traditions were pointing at the same thing, even if they pointed from different directions. There is no way to prove which reading is correct. The fragments are incomplete. Whole columns are missing. We do not know what the full Book of Giants said about Gilgamesh. What we have is enough to establish the bridge, and enough to see that someone on the Jewish side of this textual divide walked across it deliberately, used Gilgamesh's name, placed Humbaba among the Nephilim, and left the record for someone, someday, to find. The community that preserved that record copied it 9 times and buried the copies in the desert and trusted the dry limestone of the Judean hills to keep what they could not keep themselves. And the desert did. There is a number embedded in both traditions that is not, on its face, a number at all. It is a ratio, and the appearance of this ratio in both the Mesopotamian epic tradition and in the Jewish ritual texts of the Babylonian scribal schools is one of the most specific and difficult to explain parallels between the two bodies of ancient literature. The number is 2/3, and the context in which it appears makes it stranger the longer you look at it. In the opening tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving long-form narrative poem in the world, the hero is introduced with a description that any thoughtful reader must pause over. Gilgamesh, the text says, was 2/3 God and 1/3 man. The math is stated explicitly. Not part divine, not descended from gods, but a specific ratio, 2:1, divine to human. On the face of it, this ratio is biologically impossible. You cannot be 2/3 anything by parentage if simple genetics are the operating system. A child of 2 parents is 1/2 of each. A grandchild is 1/4 of each grandparent. The fractions work in powers of 2, not in thirds. For Gilgamesh to be genuinely 2/3 divine, he would have to be the child of parents, one of whom was already part divine in a specific and mathematically unusual way, which is to say, the ratio implies a prior generation of mixing. It implies, if you take it seriously, a lineage of hybrid beings that stretches back at least 2 generations. Now turn to the Mesopotamian ritual literature. In the Bit Meseri text, the Neo-Assyrian incantation series that preserves the oldest surviving catalog of the 7 antediluvian Apkallu, there is a passage about the Apkallu who came after the flood. 4 of them, rather than 7, and the text says something about them that is different from what it says about their predecessors. These 4 post-flood sages were not of fully divine descent. They were of human descent, to Zeri Amaluti in the Akkadian, but they had been endowed with wide understanding by the god Ea, who is the Akkadian name for Enki, and later, glosses in associated texts describe these 4 as being 2/3 Apkallu, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, the same ratio, in the same tradition. Applied to the same category of beings, hybrid sages of mixed divine and human descent, in a text that is entirely separate from the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the scholar Amar Anus, whose work on the relationship between the Mesopotamian and Enochic traditions has been among the most rigorous of recent decades, has argued explicitly that this ratio in the Bit Meseri is not a coincidence. It reflects a specific tradition about the nature of beings who existed in the transition zone between the divine order and the human world, beings who were not fully of one or the other, but who carried a specific and calculable proportion of each. The ratio only makes sense if there was a prior generation. If the grandparents of these hybrid sages were themselves the product of a first mixing, which brings the mathematical genealogy back to the first generation of mixing, the union of divine beings with human women that both the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition and the Enochic Watcher tradition place at the foundation of their accounts of pre-flood history. And here is where the Book of Giants enters the calculation again. Because in the Qumran fragments, Gilgamesh is named as a Nephilim, an offspring of a Watcher and a human woman, which would make him, by the logic of the Enochic genealogy, precisely 1/2 divine and 1/2 human. Not 2/3. The ratio doesn't immediately match. Unless, and this is the possibility that several scholars have begun to take seriously, the traditions are not describing first-generation hybrids when they use the 2/3 figure. They may be describing second-generation hybrids, children of a first-generation Nephilim, who then further reproduced with divine beings or with other hybrids, producing offspring with a higher proportion of the non-human in their makeup. The math in this reading is not random. It is the careful genealogical accounting of a tradition that took the specific proportions of mixed descent very seriously indeed. The parallel between the two traditions on this point is one of the most concrete connections that modern scholarship has been willing to name directly. The Assyriologist Andravkorn Kilmer noted the similarity between the Bit Meseri's post-flood hybrid sages and the Nephilim of the Hebrew tradition in an influential essay published decades ago. Amar Anas expanded on this argument in a 2010 essay in the Journal for the Study of the Pseudepigrapha, arguing that the Jewish Watcher tradition did not simply borrow general Mesopotamian themes. It borrowed the Apkallu tradition specifically, and it did so by taking the morally ambiguous hybrid figures of the post-flood Mesopotamian sages and reframing them through a Jewish theological lens as the Nephilim, the offspring of the unauthorized descent, the children of the Watchers who had defied their orders. If this argument is correct, and it is taken seriously by serious scholars, then the Nephilim of Genesis and 1st Enoch are, in a very literal textual sense, the 4 post-flood Apkallu of the Mesopotamian ritual tradition, seen through a different cultural and theological window. The hybrids of Sumer are the giants of Enoch. The same beings, remembered by 2 traditions that preserved their existence differently, but agreed on the essential fact that there were, in the deep past, beings who were neither fully human nor fully something else, that their existence was a problem, and that the problem had no clean solution. The Mesopotamian tradition handled the problem by making the hybrids partly heroic and partly cautionary. Gilgamesh is celebrated as the greatest king in Sumerian memory, even as the Bitmaseri records that the post-flood hybrid sages caused catastrophes. The Book of Enoch handled the problem by acknowledging that it could not be resolved at all, that the existence of the Nephilim was so destabilizing that the only possible response was to end them and to wash away the world that had produced them. 2 different ethical responses, the same underlying observation. There were hybrid beings. They had specific ratios of mixed descent. Their presence in the world was, in some way, that both traditions struggled to articulate fully, a problem that no ordinary solution could contain. The ratio. 2/3, 1/3. The numbers are not decorative. They are the trace of a genealogical accounting system that both traditions shared, even as they interpreted the beings those numbers described in very different moral terms. The punishment that followed the unauthorized descent of the Watchers is one of the most precisely described events in the entire Book of Enoch. This is not vague divine retribution. It is not lightning from a cloudless sky. It is not the sudden and unexplained disappearance of the offending beings into some metaphysical void. What the Book of Enoch gives us is something that reads, in places, uncomfortably like a logistics report, a plan executed in stages by named subordinates carrying out specific orders from an authority that had been patient for a very long time before finally intervening. And the thing that finally triggered the intervention was not the descent itself. It was the noise. The Book of Enoch tells us that the suffering produced by the Watchers and their offspring rose from the earth like a cry. It rose until it reached the place where the highest authority resided, described in the text with deliberate impersonality as the Lord of Spirits, the Most High, the Ancient of Days. The impression the text creates is of something so far above the immediate action that direct engagement would be almost beneath its station. The Most High does not come down to handle the problem. He delegates. The delegation is specific. He calls on 4 archangels, Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, and he gives each one a precise assignment. Raphael is given the Azazel problem. The instructions are specific to the point of being procedural. Raphael is to bind Azazel hand and foot. He is to make an opening in the desert, in a real place that the text identifies as Dudael, whose exact location has been debated by scholars, but whose name appears to be genuinely geographical. And he is to cast Azazel into that opening. He is to cover Azazel with rough and jagged rocks. He is to leave him there in absolute darkness, with no light at all, to wait. And on the day of the great judgment, the text says, Azazel will be cast into fire. Notice the precision of this. Raphael is not told to destroy Azazel. He is told to bind Azazel and place him in physical containment in a specific location. This is the language of imprisonment, not of annihilation. You imprison something that is still there. You bind something that could otherwise still act. The Book of Enoch is telling us, without commentary, that Azazel, the Watcher who taught metallurgy and weapons, is still where Raphael put him, still bound, still waiting in the dark beneath the desert. Gabriel is given the Nephilim problem, and the solution assigned to him has the cold efficiency of a strategist who understands that some opponents cannot be defeated in open battle. Gabriel is told to provoke the hybrid offspring against one another, to set them fighting among themselves, to make them turn on each other in a civil war that will accomplish the elimination of the Nephilim without requiring a direct engagement. The logic is chilling and utterly practical. The Nephilim have grown too numerous and too dangerous for any external force to confront directly, so they are turned inward on themselves, and they destroy what external force could not. Michael is given the Semyaza problem. He is to bind the leader of the unauthorized descent and all the other watchers with him in the valleys of the earth, the deep places, the underground places, the hollows where light does not penetrate. He is to bind them for 70 generations, to hold them in custody until the great day of judgment, which the text places far in the future, beyond the horizon of ordinary history. Uriel's assignment is different in kind. He is sent not to punish, but to warn. He is sent to Noah to tell him what is coming, to give him the time he needs to prepare for a catastrophe that is not aimed at him, but that will reshape everything around him. 4 assignments, 4 archangels, 4 simultaneous operations conducted against 4 distinct targets: Azazel, the Nephilim, Semyaza, and the remaining watchers, and the one righteous human who would carry the seed of the old world into the new one. The structure of the judgment sequence is worth sitting with because it does something unusual for a religious text. It presents supernatural intervention in operational terms. It reads less like theology and more like a mission briefing. Each agent is given a specific target, a specific method, and a specific outcome to produce. There is no vagueness here. There is no divine mystery left unexplained. The Most High has assessed the situation, determined that the corruption introduced by the unauthorized descent has passed the point of containable damage, and authorized a multi-pronged response designed to eliminate the immediate problem, contain the beings responsible for it, and preserve a viable remnant from which to restart. The Watchers are not destroyed. They are imprisoned. The Nephilim are not hunted down. They are weaponized against each other. Noah is not supernaturally protected. He is warned, given information, and trusted to act on it. These are not the actions of an omnipotent being who could simply unmake what has been made. These are the actions of a powerful authority working within constraints, using agents, devising solutions to problems that have specific physical and numerical parameters. The Sumerian tradition does not preserve a parallel account of the judgment of the Anunnaki. but it does preserve, in the Atrahasis epic and in the flood narratives more broadly, the decision-making process that preceded the flood. And that process has a parallel structure. The senior gods deliberate. Enlil, who holds authority over the earth, determines that the problem has become unmanageable. The Agigi, the junior gods, are sworn to secrecy, so the plan cannot be compromised. Enki, who disagrees with the decision but is bound by the oath, finds a way to warn a single human without technically violating the terms of his commitment. The parallel is not between the specific punishments described in the two traditions. The Book of Enoch and the Atrahasis epic are not telling the same story about the same judgment event. The parallel is structural. In both traditions, the intervention of the highest authority is planned, organized, executed by specific agents with specific assignments, and designed to eliminate a corrupting element while preserving a viable remnant. The logic in both cases is the same logic. The corruption has spread beyond the reach of ordinary correction. A larger response is required. The response will be catastrophic for those who brought the corruption into being, and one righteous figure will survive to carry something forward. The archangels dispatched from the highest authority, the senior gods deliberating over humanity's fate. Different names, different theological registers, different moral frameworks. The same operational pattern. This is the kind of parallel that cultural borrowing alone does not fully explain. Borrowing produces similar stories. It does not produce identical decision-making logic presented in identically structured operational terms. Something underneath the borrowing is generating the structure. What that something is remains, as it has always remained, the hardest question in all of this. The flood is the pivot on which both traditions turn. It is the event that everything before it leads toward, and everything after it emerges from. And it is the place where the structural relationship between the Sumerian and the Hebrew accounts is most visible, most specific, and most thoroughly documented by mainstream scholarship, because on this particular parallel, there is no serious academic dispute. The Hebrew flood narrative is structurally dependent on the older Mesopotamian flood narratives. The evidence for this is overwhelming, and the implications of that dependence extend further than most popular treatments are willing to follow. Let us begin with the oldest version of the flood story in the written record. In the 3rd millennium BCE, more than 1,000 years before any portion of the Hebrew Bible was committed to writing, Sumerian scribes pressed a flood narrative into clay. The survivor in that earliest version is a king named Ziusudra, a name that means something like life of long days. He is warned by the gods. He builds a boat. He rides out the flood. He emerges and offers sacrifices. He is granted immortality by the gods and placed at the ends of the earth. The story is told in bare strokes in what survives of the Sumerian text, but the architecture is unmistakable. The Old Babylonian Atrahasis epic, composed in the early 2nd millennium BCE, making it contemporaneous with the earliest stratum of what would eventually become the Hebrew Bible, gives us a much fuller account, and it is the one that rewards the closest reading. In this version, the survivor is named Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise. The flood is not presented as a response to simple human wickedness. The Atrahasis epic is specific about the cause, and the specificity is uncomfortable. The gods ordered the flood because humanity had become too numerous. Too many people making too much noise. The chief god, Enlil, cannot sleep. The specific complaint, by any modern standard, is almost comic, but the response to it is not. Enlil decides the experiment of humanity must be terminated. He gathers the other senior gods and binds them by oath to secrecy. No human must be warned. But Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the same Enki who in the older tradition had first descended to the earth and overseen the creation of humanity in the first place, disagrees with the decision. He cannot openly defy Enlil because he is bound by the oath he has sworn. So, he does what wisdom gods in every tradition do when they disagree with a decision but cannot openly oppose it. He finds a loophole. Enki goes to the dwelling of his most devoted human servant, Atrahasis in this version, and he speaks his warning to the wall of the house. He does not speak to the human. He speaks to the wall. And the human on the other side of the wall happens to overhear everything. Enki has technically kept his oath while ensuring that the information gets through. It is one of the oldest recorded examples of bureaucratic creativity. The use of procedural precision to accomplish an outcome that the procedure was designed to prevent. The warning is detailed. Atrahasis is told exactly what is coming. He is told to build a great boat, specific dimensions, specific rooms. He is told to bring his family and his livestock and the seeds he will need to replant the world. He is told to seal himself inside and wait. And when the flood comes, it is comprehensive and catastrophic. Not a regional inundation, not a river overflowing its banks, but the annihilation of the entire known world. Even the gods, the Atrahasis epic tells us, in one of its most affecting passages, are frightened by the scope of what they have set in motion. They crouch in the highest heaven and weep for the destruction they have caused. When the waters recede, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Atrahasis releases birds to test whether the land has dried enough for habitation. When the birds do not return, he knows there is land to walk on. He emerges, he builds an altar, he offers sacrifice. And the gods, the same gods who had sworn to destroy him and his kind, gather around the smell of the offerings and accept them. The standard Babylonian version of this story, preserved on Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the very tablets that layered successors pulled from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, presents the same account in Utnapishtim's voice. Gilgamesh, searching for the secret of eternal life, finds Utnapishtim at the ends of the earth and asks how a mortal man came to live forever. And Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. Every element is there: the divine council's decision, the warning through the reed wall, the boat, the dimensions, the animals, the pitch to seal the hull. The birds released in sequence: swallow, dove, raven, each one sent further than the last to test how far the waters have receded. The mountain on which the boat grounds, the sacrifice at the altar, the gods gathering around the smoke of the offerings like flies, a simile that has troubled translators for a century because of how undignified it makes the divine assembly appear, but which is preserved faithfully in every known manuscript because the scribes apparently considered it accurate. If you have read the Noah story in Genesis, you have already encountered every one of these elements. The boat with its specific dimensions, the animals, the birds sent in stages, in Genesis 2, a raven first, then a dove twice, the mountain, the altar, and the offering at the end. The detail of the birds, in particular, is so specific. Not just birds, but a specific sequence of different species sent at intervals, that it strains the limits of coincidence to imagine it arising independently in two entirely unconnected traditions. The mainstream scholarly consensus on this point, which represents more than a century of serious academic work, is that the Hebrew flood narrative is structurally derived from the older Mesopotamian accounts. This is not a fringe position. It is taught in divinity schools and published in the most conservative, peer-reviewed biblical scholarship. The names are different. The theological interpretation is different. In Genesis, the flood is a moral judgment, a response to human wickedness in general, rather than a practical decision made because humanity is too noisy for the gods to sleep comfortably. But the narrative architecture is the same because one story grew from the other. Now here is where the Book of Enoch adds a dimension that neither the Hebrew Bible nor the Mesopotamian epics contain on their own. In Genesis, the flood is sent because of human wickedness, described in general terms. The connection to the Sons of God passage in chapter 6, the 4 compressed verses about the divine beings taking human wives, is left ambiguous. The text moves from that passage to the wickedness of humanity to the decision to send the flood, but the causal chain is never made explicit. The editorial seam is visible. Something has been trimmed. The Book of Enoch makes the causal chain explicit. In the Enochic account, the flood is sent specifically because of the Watchers, because of the knowledge they transmitted without authorization, because of the hybrid offspring whose appetites were consuming the world, because of the corruption that had spread from the original, unauthorized descent into every corner of the human civilization that had grown from it. The Watchers are the cause. The flood is the response. The corruption the Watchers introduced is the corruption that must be washed away. This is the same logic that runs through the Mesopotamian accounts, in both the Atrahasis and the Gilgamesh version, where the flood is ultimately a response to a problem that the gods themselves created. In both traditions, the flood is not so much a punishment of humanity as it is the correction of a divine mistake, a reset of an experiment that had gone irreversibly wrong. And in both traditions, the bridge across the reset is a single righteous man who is warned, builds the boat, survives the annihilation, and carries the seed of the old world into the new one. Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Noah, 4 names for the same function in the same story structure, the vessel that preserves the remnant. The one person on the right side of a catastrophe that the higher order could not resolve any other way. The structural debt is undeniable, but the Book of Enoch suggests something more than debt. It suggests that the story being preserved in both traditions is not merely a myth about the relationship between gods and humans. It is a memory, however filtered, however culturally translated, however theologically reinterpreted, of an actual intervention, of a world that had become, through a series of decisions made by beings with far greater power than ordinary humans, irreparably corrupted, and of the means by which that corruption was addressed. The boat is the same boat. The birds are the same birds. The mountain is the same mountain. The altar is the same altar. The smoke rising is the same smoke, rising from two different traditions toward the same sky. Before the night closes, there is a question that has been waiting underneath everything we have read. Not the question of whether the events described in these texts actually happened. That question is honest, but maybe permanently unanswerable. The question underneath it is this: why did these stories disappear? And the follow-up question, the one that has become more urgent in the past 80 years, is why they are coming back. The erasure of the Book of Enoch from the Western Christian tradition was not a single dramatic act. There was no council that voted to destroy it, no pope who issued a decree forbidding it. The erasure was a process of omission, slow and largely accidental in its mechanisms, shaped by the institutional priorities of an early church that was trying to establish clear and defensible boundaries around what counted as authoritative scripture. The Book of Enoch described a world that was theologically inconvenient, a world in which divine beings could make independent decisions to defy their own authority, could take physical forms, could produce biological offspring, could be punished and imprisoned rather than simply unmade. A world, in other words, that was far more materially complicated than the theological framework the Church was developing in its first several centuries. The claim that divine beings had physically descended to the earth and reproduced with human women was not merely strange. It was structurally threatening to a theology that needed to maintain clear categories: God on one side, humanity on the other, with only the singular and theologically unique figure of Christ mediating between them. The Watchers complicated that binary in ways that were difficult to manage. The hybrid offspring complicated it further. The imprisonment of the Watchers rather than their annihilation, the implication that they were still somewhere, still bound, still waiting, complicated it most of all. The Sumerian tablets disappeared by a different mechanism. They were not suppressed. They were simply buried by the same historical forces that buried the civilization that produced them. The Assyrian Empire fell in 612 BCE. The cities of Mesopotamia were conquered and reconquered over the following centuries. The tradition of cuneiform writing, a technology that required years of specialized training to master, died out gradually as Aramaic became the administrative language of the Near East, and then as Greek replaced Aramaic in the Hellenistic period. By the time of Christ, no one was pressing marks into wet clay tablets. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, no one alive could read the marks that had been pressed for 3 millennia before them. 2 different mechanisms, the same result: silence. And then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the silence broke in the most contingent possible ways. A romantically inclined British traveler decided to dig in an Iraqi mound he had heard about from locals. A shepherd looking for a lost animal threw a stone into a crack in a cliff above a desert sea. 2 accidents of individual human curiosity, separated by almost exactly a century, each one recovering something that had been out of reach for more than 1,000 years. It is worth sitting with the contingency of this. The Book of Enoch survived because a single Christian community in a single East African country, in a single ancient language, refused to let it go, not out of any documented intention to preserve forbidden knowledge, but simply because it was part of their scriptural inheritance, and they saw no reason to abandon it. If the Ethiopian Orthodox Church had not preserved what it preserved, and if James Bruce had not gone to Ethiopia looking for the source of the Nile, and if Bruce had not had the judgment to bring back manuscripts, the Western world's re-encounter with the Book of Enoch would have had to wait until 1947. And even then, the Dead Sea fragments would have been far more difficult to contextualize, without the complete Ethiopian text to compare them to. Contingency stacked on contingency, every link in the chain of preservation, depending on decisions made by individuals who mostly did not know they were preserving something the rest of the world had lost. The Sumerian tablets have a similar story of accidental survival. The fires that destroyed Nineveh preserved Ashurbanipal's library by baking the clay into ceramic. The very catastrophe that was supposed to erase the library was what allowed it to last another 2,500 years. And the decisions made by a king who could read in several languages, including a language that had been dead for 1,000 years by his own time, decisions that led him to send agents across his empire to collect the oldest surviving texts. Those decisions produced a library that no subsequent civilization would have thought to assemble. The reemergence of these stories is sometimes framed, in popular treatments, as a kind of cosmic disclosure, as if the texts had been waiting to come back at the right moment, as if their return in the mid-20th century was somehow meaningful in relation to the technological and cultural developments of that period. That framing is understandable, but probably says more about the human tendency to find pattern in contingency than it does about the texts themselves. What is true is that the return of the texts has changed the intellectual landscape in ways that are still working themselves out. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 and their gradual publication over the following decades, the last significant portions were not made publicly available until the 1990s, transformed the study of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity in ways that continue to reverberate in the scholarly literature. Scholars like Helge Kvanvig, Amar Anus, Hendrik Dronel, Lauren Stukenbrook, and Michael Heiser have spent careers working on the relationship between the Mesopotamian and the Enochic traditions, and their work has produced a picture of the ancient world that is far stranger, far more interconnected, and far more textually rich than what was available even 50 years ago. The mainstream conclusion of that scholarly work is clear and should be stated clearly. The parallels between the Sumerian tablets and the Book of Enoch exist primarily because of literary transmission. Jewish scribes, especially in the period after the Babylonian exile, had extensive access to Mesopotamian literary traditions and absorbed their themes, structures, and figures into their own religious imagination. The Book of Enoch borrows from the Apkallu tradition. The Book of Giants borrows Gilgamesh and Humbaba by name. The flood narrative borrows from the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh traditions in ways that are textually demonstrable. This is the consensus. It is based on serious work, and it accounts for most of what we have read tonight. And yet the residue remains. Cultural borrowing produces general thematic resemblance. It produces shared motifs and parallel structures and recognizable narrative shapes. It does not typically produce the precise numerical ratios, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, appearing independently in two texts whose relationship is supposed to be one of general cultural influence rather than direct textual dependence. It does not produce the seventh Apkallu ascending to heaven and the seventh patriarch from Adam being taken by God in two separate traditions with identical structural position and function. It does not produce a Jewish text that names Gilgamesh as a Nephilim, not as a literary allusion, but as a full narrative character sharing the emotional life of the story, and then identifies Humbaba alongside him as a second named giant. These specifics suggest something underneath the borrowing, something that the borrowing was borrowing from. An older common source, perhaps. A shared memory of actual events interpreted through different cultural and theological lenses, or, the most uncomfortable possibility, a genuine convergence of two traditions that were, at some level, describing the same real beings, the same real events, with all the variation in detail and moral framing that two different perspectives on the same history would naturally produce. The honest answer is that no one can choose between these possibilities on the basis of the evidence currently available. New fragments of cuneiform are still being identified and published. The Dead Sea Scrolls are still being studied, and portions were published only within the last 20 years. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition contains texts that Western scholars have only partial access to. The work of reading the ancient world is not finished. It will probably never be finished. Every generation of scholars adds something and finds that the picture is a little more complicated, a little stranger, a little harder to summarize than the generation before them had thought. What we can say with confidence is this: 3 sets of objects are sitting in archives and museum cases in Jerusalem, and Ammon and Oxford, and London and Berlin. One set is a collection of clay tablets pressed by scribes who died 4,000 years ago, in a language that went silent for 2 millennia and has only been partially reconstructed. Another set is a collection of papyrus scrolls and parchment fragments preserved in clay jars in a desert cave for more than 2,000 years, in a language that was dying even then. And the third set, the bridge between the first two, is a collection of Aramaic fragments that name Gilgamesh as a Nephilim and Humbaba as a giant, and place them both inside the story of the Watchers as if they had always been there. These objects have outlasted almost everything around them, the empires that produced them, the languages they were written in, the civilizations that rose and fell in the centuries after they were sealed away. They have outlasted the councils that decided which texts were worth keeping and which were not. They have outlasted the fires that were supposed to destroy them and the silences that were supposed to bury them. They are still here, still asking the question they have always been asking. There is an echo in all of this that reaches further than the 2 traditions we have been examining. In ancient Greece, there is the myth of the Titans, the older divine generation, the beings who ruled before the Olympian gods, who were defeated in a great war and imprisoned beneath the earth in Tartarus, bound there by the victorious younger gods. Early Christian writers who wanted to explain the Book of Enoch to Greek-speaking audiences simply translated Watchers as Titans. The correspondence was too obvious to require argument, and the word Tartarus appears in the second letter of Peter, in a passage about the binding of the angels who sinned, in language that draws on both the Enochic and the Greek mythological traditions simultaneously. In the Greek myth of Prometheus, a divine being defies the explicit prohibition of the highest authority, steals the foundation of human technology, gives it to a species that was not supposed to have it, and is bound to a rock and tortured as punishment. The structure is the Watcher story in a different mythological register. The fire of Prometheus is the metallurgy of Azazel. The rock to which Prometheus is chained is the rough and jagged stones under which Raphael buried Azazel in Dudael. In the Egyptian Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu in the Ptolemaic period, but preserving what Egyptologists generally consider to be much older temple traditions, there is an account of a primordial time in which a group of divine beings descended to a primeval island and established the first sanctuary. The texts describe the ancestors, the seven sages, a great flood that ended the primordial age, a generation of builder gods who came before the human pharaohs. Seven sages, a flood, builder gods who preceded ordinary human civilization. The number, the flood, the founding function, all present. In the Andean traditions of pre-Columbian South America, a divine figure named Viracocha is said to have emerged from Lake Titicaca in the primordial time, traveled across the landscape teaching the arts of civilization, and then walked out across the Pacific Ocean to disappear into the west. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec tradition preserved the story of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who came to teach and then departed, promising return. In the oral traditions of several North American nations, there are accounts of teachers who came from the sky and brought the first knowledge of agriculture and ceremony. None of these parallels are as granular as the parallel between the Sumerian and Enochic accounts. None of them share the specific ratios and the named individuals and the common textual bridges that we have examined tonight. But all of them are pointing in the same general direction. All of them are saying, in different languages and different frameworks, the same basic thing. That knowledge came from somewhere, that the somewhere was not ordinary, that the bringers of the knowledge were not quite like us. You can read this as a universal pattern in human storytelling, a narrative instinct that expresses itself everywhere because it serves a universal psychological function, because it is easier to imagine knowledge as a gift than as an achievement, because origin myths everywhere tend to involve givers from above. This reading is intellectually respectable, and a great deal of serious comparative mythology operates within it. But the residue remains. The universal pattern explains why stories about divine teachers exist in general. It does not explain why two specific ancient traditions, separated by 1,000 miles of desert and mountain, tell almost the same story in almost the same structural terms, with the same specific numbers, the same named individuals, the same seventh position ascension, the same hybrid ratios, the same sequence of descent and teaching and punishment and flood and survivor. It does not explain why the Book of Giants, composed by a Jewish writer in Aramaic, preserved in a cave by the Dead Sea, names a Sumerian king as one of the Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6, in a narrative context that treats the identification not as a literary flourish, but as a historical fact. The universal pattern is part of the answer. It is not, by itself, the whole answer. And the whole answer, if it exists, is still waiting in the fragments that have not yet been fully translated, in the manuscripts that have not yet been fully collated, in the caves that have not yet been fully excavated, in the connections that have not yet been made between texts that are being studied in separate institutions by scholars who have not yet found occasion to read each other's work. The tablets will still be here in the morning. So will the fragments. So will the bridge. So will the question. Some questions are not problems to be solved on a schedule. They are companions to be carried through waking and through sleep, through seasons and through years. They ask nothing of you except that you hold them, the way you might hold a stone you found on a beach that was exactly the right weight, for exactly the right reason, in exactly the right moment. You do not need to know what it means. You need only to keep it in your pocket. The scribes who pressed these marks into wet clay 4,000 years ago could not have imagined that anyone would be reading their work in a world this transformed. The men who sealed those scrolls in clay jars and buried them in the desert above the Dead Sea could not have known that the dry limestone of the Judean hills would preserve what they were entrusting to it for 2 millennia. They made their choices with what they had, in the time they had, with whatever conviction led them to believe that the stories they were preserving were worth the cost of preservation. They were right. Whatever the stories are, literary inheritance, cultural echo, or the filtered memory of events that genuinely happened, they were worth keeping. The fact that they survived is itself a kind of argument. Objects that survive when they should not survive are objects that something wanted to keep. The tablets wanted to be found. The scrolls wanted to be read. The Book of Giants wanted to name Gilgamesh. And you, here, now, at whatever hour this is reaching you, are part of a chain of transmission that runs from the scribes of Nineveh and the scholars of Qumran all the way to this moment. You have read what was written. You have held the question. That is enough. That has always been enough. Let your breathing slow. Let the room settle around you. The tablets are not going anywhere. The fragments are not going anywhere. The question that has been sitting in those objects for 4,000 years will still be sitting in them tomorrow, patient as clay, quiet as the dark beneath a desert mountain where something old and bound is waiting for a judgment that the texts say has not yet come. Sleep well. Dream of old stones. And if you wake in the night with the sense that you have been somewhere you cannot name, somewhere that felt like a library full of things you almost know, that is the feeling working. That is the feeling the old stories were designed to produce. They have been producing it for 4,000 years. They are very good at their work.